Hi everyone, welcome back. In my first video, I introduced you to three worlds: the world behind the text, the world inside the text, and the world in front of the text. In this second video, I want to talk with you a little bit more about what we mean by a world. Before I do that, though, a quick word of explanation. The names I've given you so far are not the only names New Testament scholars give to the three worlds of the text. And by the way, this is just one example of what I talked about in the first video, the lack of consensus agreement among New Testament scholars in today's world from time to time. Anyway, what you need to know is that the three worlds can sometimes be named in different ways. I may even use different ways of naming them as we move through these lectures and through our course. So quickly, the world behind the text can also be called the historical or the cultural world. As you'll see in a moment, that world cultural also opens up a lot of different names for different parts of the cultural world behind the text. The world inside the text, as I usually call it, can also be called the world of the text, or the world that belongs to the text, or the world created by the text, or the world in the text. And the world in front of the text can also be called the existential world of the text. And we'll discuss that word existential and what it means later on. Or it can be called by some, for some ethnic or geographical part of the contemporary world we live in. So scholars talk about a Western European world, or an Asian world, or an African world, or an African American world, or a feminist world, and interpret the New Testament with that world in front of the text as they read or write about it, because that usually is the existential part of the world of the author who names themselves with one of these names. But it's important to understand that however we name them, each of the three worlds has defined dimensions of space and time and culture as it exists in a certain space and time. So first of all, in terms of space, in the three worlds, in each of them, there are physical realities like geographical reality and topographical reality, and cultural realities that develop around those two realities that have to do with space, like the boundaries of a city or a country, or the grade of the road that goes up or down from Jerusalem. Now, how about time? In terms of time, each of the three worlds exists in a time defined by its past, the history that lies behind it, its present, the time during which it's read and written, and an expected future. So time in the world behind the text of the New Testament is defined as the time before and during the time a particular New Testament text is written, along with the expectations within that time that exist for the future. So for instance, in Luke, when Luke writes in chapter 1 and verse 5 these words, and I'm quoting now from the RSV text, "In the days of Herod, king of Judea." When Luke writes those words, part of what we need to do is understand the time frame Luke is describing for us. Herod began to rule as king roughly around 34 BC, or BCE, as you'll sometimes see it abbreviated. BCE is a different way of naming time that's used not only by Christians but by people of other faiths. And so we talk about particularly the Jewish faith before the Common Era, before the era that Judaism and Christianity shared together after the time of Jesus. So Herod began to rule as king around 34 BC, or before that Common Era that Judaism and Christianity share. And Herod reigned until his death again around 4 BC or BCE. Luke tells us during that same time, and I'm quoting now from the biblical text, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah, And he had a wife of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So what was that time like? What was happening in that time around the lives of Zechariah and Elizabeth? What are some of the historical events that help us set their lives in the context of their own time and potentially add meaning to the story that Luke wants to tell us in chapter 1? When we do our best to travel back in time from our time in the 21st century to enter the time the text is talking about, the time in the text and behind the text, we're studying the text diachronically. Diachronically. D-I-A-C-H-R-O-N-I-C-A-L-L-Y. Diachronically. That's a word in English that derives etymologically from Greek. For in Greek, the first three letters, dia, come from a preposition which means through. And the last part of the word diachronic comes from a Greek word chronos, which means time. So diachronic time is passing through time. When we study the text diachronically, we are passing through time, back through time, from our time into the world behind the text, the time that historically lies behind that world and the time in the world inside the text is different. Time in the world inside the text is exactly what the name implies. It's the time, again, past, present, and future, that exists in a particular literary world, a particular literary creation, a particular literary text. That time can be the same as the world behind the text, or it can be different. In Revelation, for instance, in chapter 1, John refers to the fact that he was, and I'm quoting now, in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, a specific time, which for us, as we read Revelation, exists in the world behind the text. But in Revelation chapters 6, 7, and 8, John goes on to describe how the seals of a scroll are opened by referring to time like this. When he, the Lamb, opened the second seal, and then when he opened the third seal, and then when he opened the fourth seal, and as the seals are opened, events take place on earth, but we're no longer in the time when John is writing. We are seeing in his vision a time that is different than that. So at this point in Revelation, John is describing time that's not measured in hours or minutes, but in seals. And he's inviting us as readers to enter that time with him, to enter into a literary, visionary, prophetic, apocalyptic world of time. And John is hoping his words, written with the help of the Holy Spirit, will be vivid enough to enable our imaginations to enter that same world with him, to enter that world of time where time is measured by the breaking apart of seals, so that in our imagination we might see through his description what he saw in a vision and hear what he heard. When we travel from our time into a world of time created by a literary text like that, we study the text synchronically. Synchronically is the same as diachronically, except the first three letters are different, and they are S-Y-N. S-Y-N in Greek means in or within. Chronos again means time. So when we enter into the time in a particular literary text, the time created by that literary text, we are studying the text synchronically. The third kind of time world is the time world in front of the text, time in the world in front of the text. In a way, any time a text is read by a reader after it's written is time in the world in front of the text. I say in a way because this definition can include the way the text was read by people after it was created by an author. there's overlap there between the time behind the text, because the time when the text is read by people in the first century is still 20 centuries behind our 21st century. But in a way, as they read the text after it's written by an author, even if that time span is not very long in between the writing and the reading, in a way, even when a text is read by people after it's written, or when the text is written by people in the early centuries of Christianity, what's called the patristic period, or when the text is written during the Reformation period of church history, or when a text is read in the modern or postmodern period, anytime you can define, like the 19th century period or the period after World War II, in reality, anytime you read someone's interpretation of a text from any historical period, even one very close to the time of the writing, you are reading something from the world behind you, and you're reading something from people who stood and read the text in front of that world from within that period. So the patristic writers read the text in front of the world, read the text in front of the world from within their historical, cultural, existential world of the patristic centuries. Reformers read the world out of their existential world. Modern and postmodern readers read it out of their existential world. So practically speaking, in New Testament studies and books you'll read, time in the world in front of the text is narrowed down in some way. It means the time at which the person who is writing, whose interpretation of the text you're reading, whose existential experience that shapes the world in front of the text and shapes their reading of the text, is what you're reading. Anyone who reads a text anytime after it's written is interpreting that text out of their own existential world, whether they're conscious of doing that or not. And because of that, when you or I or anyone else reads a text in the time in front of the text, we can only read it existentially. And now it's time to define what that word existential means. It too derives from Greek, because like the words diachronic and synchronic, it has two parts. EX on the front of the word existential derives from a Greek preposition that means out or out of. And the rest of the word may very possibly come from a Greek verb that means to be. So the word existential means out of my being. In English, we use it to talk about meaning that grows out of a person's existential experience, their individual experience, their personal history. So for instance, when I interpret the meaning of a New Testament text, like Matthew 15 in verses 21 through 28, which is the story about the faith of a Canaanite woman who asked Jesus to drive a demon out of her daughter, my interpretation, looking at the text in front of me, will be colored by my experience as a male living in the 21st century, not the first century, which may allow the story to mean less to me or more to me than it should, but it will certainly color the way I read and interpret the story. And since I'm a male, not a female, a man, not a woman, a Western European man who lives in America, not Africa or Asia, a man who is Caucasian, not Hispanic or African American, a man who's middle class and not poor or upper class, at least according to the last census. All these cultural factors can allow the story to mean less to me or more to me than it should. But when I say that, I'm starting to talk about the third real dimension that exists in each of the three worlds. Each world, as we've seen in this lecture, is a real world of space and time. But it's also a real world of culture. And we'll talk more about that cultural dimension of each of the three worlds in the next video. Why is all this important? Well, because it teaches me, and I hope all of you too, there's a lot we can learn about the space and the time in each of the three worlds. And in the next lecture, as I mentioned, we'll go on and look at culture. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I look forward to meeting you online for the third lecture soon.